Hello everybody and welcome to the Minolta MCW Rokkor 28mm Rokkor. Wait, did I say that wrong? I think I said that wrong. Let me start over. Hello everybody and welcome to the Minolta MCW Rokkor 28mm f3.5 round glass review. This lens was made by Minolta. Minolta made 28mm f3.5 lenses for their SR mount bodies from 1963 through sometime after 1981. 1981 being the year that the last version was released. In sum, the Rokkor version of this lens has 8 iterations, of which this was the 5th. Minolta also made a Celtic 28mm f3.5 and at least one version of this focal length and aperture in M39 mount, but that used a vastly different lens design than the SR mount lenses. This lens lineage is a bit interesting as the 3.5 lineup from 63 to 75 had 2 optical design iterations, both retrofocus and both 7.7 designs. The lens in this video, the MCW Rokkor, introduced a new 5-element 5-group design which persisted through the final version of this lens, the aforementioned release in 1981. Typical lens uses for 28mm lenses include landscapes, close-up work. As a general walk-around lens, they're very good, street photography, and also for travel photography. Let me cut to the chase, and you guys can go watch, I don't know, one of the other YouTubers. If you watched my Rokkor 28mm f3.5 review, you'll be pleased to hear that this focal length and aperture combo is batting 2 for 2 so far. This lens delivers good sharpness by the standards of its day and stunning color rendition. The lens is soft in the corners and does get a bit softer as the image moves away from the center. That's to be expected with budget lenses from the 70s, however. All that said, this lens is a great performer and well worth the cost, especially since it will run less than the faster options. So giving you nothing that you couldn't find out by either, asking one of the AI search engines or spending an hour and a half doing some Google ninjutsu, the focal length and AOV are 28mm and 75.4 degrees on full frame. The aperture range is 3.5 to 16 in half stops. The element and group count are 5 and 5, design type retrofocus. Filter size is 55mm. The closest focus is 0.3 meters, which in the US is 87.8 fingernail days. The drive type is manual focus only. Native mount is Minolta SR only. Dimensions are 64.5mm by 41.5mm, and it weighs in at a honestly quite high for a lens of this size, 220 grams. Where this lens works the best is with subjects closer than around 10 feet. This is a lens that likes being focused close up, and if you use this lens for that type of work, you'll be happier with your results. As a general statement, 28mm lenses are well suited on full frame for wide-angle subjects such as landscapes, seascapes, cityscapes, some architecture work, and also some astrophotography. The f3.5 aperture on this lens shouldn't be a particular deterrent from any of those, but the wide-open softness should be if you're considering this lens for high-end work. As a general statement, too, this is not a lens well suited for portrait work on a full-frame sensor. Cropped to micro four thirds, however, and it could work suitably for that. On APS-C, this is a suitable general use lens, and the APS-C format removes most of the distortion and light loss too. This lens performs much differently in terms of sharpness across the aperture range. Wide open, it's at its softness. For some subjects, that can work well. As an example of that softness, with my Minolta A7 IV, this lens is so soft, wide open, that the center of the image cannot return results for focus peaking. There is a ring outside of the center of the image that is sharp enough that focus peaking can hone in on things that are in focus in that ring. Quite bizarre performance that indicates some field curvature. Also wide open, however, this lens exhibits bright perimeters on out-of-focus source points, so if that's not something you like, as that is not something I like, this lens is not going to be to your taste, wide open, with lights in otherwise dark frames. This lens design must have been pretty good given that it survived the SR mount's conversion into MC and MD lenses. Also, being a Rokkor lens instead of a Celtic indicates that this was a higher-end lens. And yes, being the lowest spec focal length in the high spec tier does still mean that this was a higher spec lens. The Celtic 28mm f3.5 SR lens arrived around 1980, which may have partially heralded this lens design's end with its 1981 release. The Celtic lens, however, used 7 elements in 7 groups, and despite my efforts, I could not find a diagram for it to discuss how it differs from this lens, being that both of those, the Celtic and this lens, would have been considered budget offerings when people were buying lenses, 40 years ago. If you'd like to check out the design iterations of the Rokkor lenses of this focal length and aperture, check out this video's descriptions, and there's a link to a website called artefat.ch. Breathing is noticeable from the nearest focus point of 0.3 meters to 1 meter out, a throw of 0.7 meters. The front element moves in and out 3.5 millimeters, which is 12.5% of the lens's focal length. For 28 millimeters, that's a noticeable amount of lateral movement, and that directly relates to the amount of breathing. Aperture is stepped at half-stop increments from f5.6 and smaller, so the aperture will not stop down smoothly for video. The front element is non-rotating, but as noted, moves in and out slightly. Focus throw is 150 degrees, and the focus ring is stationary, wide enough for a focus gear to be attached, and either rubber or milled metal, depending on which specific iteration of this lens you have. And as a note, also this lens being manual focus, you will not have to worry about your on-camera audio picking up autofocus motor noise. Sharpness is good in the center by f5.6 down to around f11. Corners are pretty smeary wide open and still a hair soft at f16, but as I've said before in other videos, if someone's assailing your photo because the corners are soft, then congratulations on taking a perfect photo with no other flaws. So using the entire image, sharpness on this lens is absolutely suitable for image taking and use, even if it may not hold up on pixel level scrutiny. Build quality is very good, in line with lenses of the time. I do prefer lenses with milled rings versus rubber rings, as the rubber can degrade over time. However, the handling on this lens, which is what matters, is lovely. Contrast is a bit flat on digital, suitable on film. In general, I like a flatter lens because it's easy to add contrast in post, very hard to remove it. Aperture stars are 6-pointed and grow longer and larger as the aperture closes. The aperture stars created by this lens aren't pleasing, but they also aren't ugly. So they're there and innocuous. For the out-of-focus areas, this really only applies when you focus very closely with this lens, as it's hard to obtain blurry backgrounds for most photos, because by the time you're focused at around a meter and out and stop down to f5.6 or f8, there's enough depth of field that blurry areas are just there and really not that blurry. Out-of-focus areas are okay wide open, though, as noted, source point light has those bright perimeters. Stop down even to f5.6, and out-of-focus areas start getting a bit jittery. Distortion is strong, especially on the peripheries. This shows up when your images have vertical or horizontal lines near the image peripheries. For many uses, though, you're not likely to notice the barrel distortion. Light loss is present at all apertures, though only minimally at f16. This manifests dramatically when photographing a white screen up close at infinity focus. In real-world use, the light loss is less noticeable, and really, it's more of an image character element, and it's definitely not a flaw. Flare was hard to achieve, and I only managed it a few times. When it exists, it's not incredibly beneficial to images and creates a colored pattern, surprisingly, on both digital and film. Ghosting was also very hard to achieve and only manifests when the light is at very specific angles to the lens. As a note, I did not use a lens hood with this lens at all. Balance with cameras is good. This lens is a nice mix of weight and size, and it feels good on the front of both film SLRs and mirrorless cameras. Asterisk, I tend to use heavier mirrorless cameras. A lighter mirrorless cameras like one of the old Nexes or something like an A5000. This lens would feel very front heavy on, especially if you put a speed booster behind the lens. Color shift across apertures is a new feature for this video series. I'm going to start including it now. Here's a test that I designed to show how the lens shifts color over the aperture range. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to start wide open and then stop down with the white balance on the camera fixed for the lighting conditions. Some lenses exhibit noticeable color tint shifts. And if we saw my Nikkor lens in this series, Rokkor 28mm 3.5, it exhibits noticeable color shifts with wide open images being very warm, stop down images being very cool. The Rokkor 28mm 3.5 does not appear to have a noticeable color shift over the aperture range. This is the second 28mm f3.5 lens that I've reviewed now, and for those of you who, like me, enjoy this focal length and speed, yes, more are on the way. At least Olympus, Pentax, and Konica. The Minolta 28mm f3.5 is a suitably sharp lens. It won't disappoint. When stopped down and the detail level it captures from f5.6 to f8, well, that's very good. It does exhibit more softness wide open than other comparable lenses, however. Taken as a solo offering, I would rank this as a fine lens, but not a standout among its peers. One thing that I like about the Rokkor 28mm f3.5 is that it performs consistently across the aperture ranges in terms of color and contrast. This means that the color cast and contrast will remain consistent and predictable across the apertures, and that facilitates editing work and image consistency. One thing I do not like about this lens is that it is noticeably soft wide open. Live view use will show that, and it exhibits field curvature at f3.5 as well. Both of these issues manifest as the lens being soft in an area near the middle, to the point that, as I noted, my Sony a7 IV had trouble with focus peaking on this lens in the middle of the image circle when wide open. As a last observation about the MC Rokkor W 28mm f3.5, it also performs remarkably well on digital, which is not universally true of vintage lenses. For shooters invested in the Minolta SR system as well as digital, this can be a viable option and a good travel lens. It is far from the smallest of the similar lenses, and it's not as refined an experience in terms of use. But as the images in this video ought to show, it performs in a predictable and consistent manner that should meet or exceed the expectations of most casual photographers.